All right. So hello, everyone, and welcome again to Virtual Constitution Day. I'm Professor Sarah Crabtree, and I'm pleased to welcome two wonderful colleagues. I'll introduce them both, and then we'll have a conversation about Dr. Melissa R. Klapper's work. So our first in our kind of Brady Bunch screen to the left-hand side here is Dr. Melissa R. Klapper. She's a professor of history and the director of Women's and Gender Studies at Rowan University, where she teaches American and women's history and the history of childhood. She is the author of numerous books, including Jewish Girls Coming of Age in America, 1860 to 1920, and that was in 2005. Small Strangers, The Experiences of Immigrant Children in the United States from 1880 to 1925, that was in 2007. The book we look forward to talking about today, which is Ballots, Babies, and Banners of Peace, American Jewish Women's Activism from 1890 to 1940, that book was 2013, and won the National Jewish Book Award in Women's Studies. Her most recent book is Ballet Class, An American History, and that was published this year. Below me in our Brady Bunch format is Dr. Rachel Gross. She is an assistant professor and the John and Marcia Goldman Chair in American Jewish Studies and the Department of Jewish Studies here at San Francisco State. She's a religious studies scholar whose work focuses on 20th and 21st century American Jews. She is the author of Beyond the Synagogue, Jewish Nostalgia as Religious Practice, and that is forthcoming from New York University Press in January 2021. At SF State, she teaches fantastic courses in US Jewish history, Jews and food, and Jews and pop culture, among other topics. So welcome to both of you. Melissa, I wonder if we could just start out with kind of a little bit of a background question. What drew you to the topic of Jewish women's participation in what we sort of call the first wave feminist movements? What interested you here?
Well, what interested me primarily was absence. It bugged me as starting back all the way in graduate school when I was getting my doctorate in women's history at Rutgers. It annoyed me that everything I was reading about American women's history had no space or very limited space for Jewish women. As a Jewish woman myself, I guess this is an identity statement, but it annoyed me that Jewish women were really absent. Occasionally you would see reference to a Jewish women labor activist, which is good and should be there, but it bothered me. And then when I was working on my book, Jewish Girls Coming of Age in America, I noticed how many people, and I'll come back to this, but how many of the girls I was looking at were involved even in their adolescence, but certainly in their adulthood, in some form of social movement. And so I became very interested in thinking about Jewish women in political movements and in social activism, but not inside the Jewish community. Within Jewish women's history, there had been some attention paid to Jewish women in Zionist organizations like Hadassah, for instance, and again, Jewish women in the labor movement. There's wonderful scholarship about that. But there was just nothing about Jewish women in, as we call it, as you say, first wave feminism. And to me, this was a major absence. So these days, you can't just write a book because somebody's missing. You have to have something positive to say as well. And I was really interested in investigating the impact that Jewish women had on these movements, but also contributing to the rewriting of a narrative that talks about these movements as all about middle-class, white, Christian, usually Protestant women, primarily in the Northeast, with maybe a sprinkling of California for good measure. And I wanted to be part of rewriting that narrative. I mean, that has been a project, and I think we've really been seeing that in this centennial year of the 19th Amendment. We've been seeing, new, exciting, really important work. It's a shame that it's new, but it's important work on African-American women and on other, on Native American women, on Latino women, all these different groups that were involved in suffrage, and I would argue in other movements as well. So my motivation really came from there. I wanted to be part of rewriting that, to make it a more inclusive and diverse history, to better reflect the actual history as it was, and also the problems that were involved with a more diverse, take on this history. And then from the Jewish women's history perspective, I think it is extremely telling for thinking about what the position of the American Jewish community was in the late 19th and early 20th century, that there was, in fact, this major participation of Jewish women. The book is about suffrage, birth control, and peace. And in all of those movements, and especially in birth control and peace, Jewish women really changed the trajectory of those movements, both in the United States and internationally as well. So the short answer, I guess, is that it's a story that hadn't been told. And as a historian, that's what I'm always looking for. I like to write about things that no one has ever written about before.
Melissa, I absolutely love your book, and I'm so glad it's there to fill the gap and to tell us more about Jewish women's activism. Can you tell us about some of the arguments that Jewish women suffrage activists made?
Well, what's interesting about this is that, I want to make this point that Jewish women were involved, but Jewish women were not monolithic. Jewish women, that's a very large identity category, and they were divided across every kind of divide you can think of. Class, I would even say race to a certain extent, and that's related to class and how white or not white different groups of Jewish women were perceived as being. That also depended on immigration status, nationality, citizenship of origin, that kind of thing. Religious practice, ethnic identity, nationalism, and of course, a lot of that goes back also to the question of what does being Jewish even mean? Which is not there's no answer to that, but race, religion, ethnicity, nationality, cultural heritage, you name it, there's lots of ways to define Jewishness. And so Jewish women, unsurprisingly, because of the diversity within American Jewish women as a group, made lots of different kinds of arguments. For instance, middle-class women, Jewish women, typically made the same kind of argument that other middle-class white American women made. It has to do with maternalism, for instance, the idea that their position as mothers, and there was just this assumption that all women would ultimately be wives and mothers, that their position as mothers gave them a special kind of unique place and power and was a acceptable motivating factor for all kinds of political activism. If you trust me, the mother, to take care of your children, the citizens of the future, well, then obviously I should have to vote. That was a very compelling argument for a lot of people. So that was one argument. And in fact, Jewish women used that argument as a kind of bridge to working with other groups of American women, because motherhood was something that most groups of American women at the turn of the century could agree on. So maternalism served as a kind of unifying bridge across many of the divides that kept people apart. So there was that kind of argument. Now, working class Jewish women, many of whom were equally invested in motherhood, certainly in the cultural sense, believed in that, but they were a little more cynical about it, and they were certainly more cynical about arguments about sisterhood, which is different than motherhood. The idea that all women would be sisters together and somehow go off and getting the right to vote would somehow allow them to fix the world, to repair the world in some way. Working class women were much more cynical about that. They knew that they did not share interests with people from different class backgrounds necessarily. And they were much more likely to focus on, we need the vote because if we get the vote, then we will have better working conditions. We'll have political power. The powers that be, the male powers that be, the political structures, the capitalist structures can't ignore us if we have the right to vote. So it was not always the priority issue for all working class women, but it was still seen as something that was important for making progress and improving the conditions of their own lives. If you look at the very far left, I guess we'll call it, the anarchist like Emma Goldman, who wasn't that committed to government in general, she wrote essays actually about suffrage where she kind of thought, couldn't hurt, not really important, it wasn't the major thing for her. This was actually an issue in general for socialist women, not just Jewish women. If they were supposed to be prioritizing class interests, how could they be suffragists and prioritize gender interests? And there were conflicts there. And in fact, a woman named Teresa Serber Malkiel in New York started a socialist suffrage club for Jewish women. And the socialists basically made her shut it down because it was too gender related. They didn't stop her from individually from being a suffrage activist, nor did they say that suffrage was a bad idea. The Second International, the group that set socialist policy, so to speak, was okay with suffrage activism, but always in service of class interests. And then something that brought Jewish women of many backgrounds together was actually Jewish arguments for suffrage. And not everybody, not all the women I worked on made religious arguments or made Jewish arguments. That would not be the right impression to leave, but many did. And they looked back into Jewish history and they identified examples of Jewish leaders from the Bible, people like Miriam, that's Moses' sister, who led the women during the Exodus from Egypt. Right? There was Deborah, who was a judge. There was Esther, who saved her people for the Purim story. And they took these examples and said, look, clearly within Judaism, there is lots of space for Jewish women's leadership and political participation. It's Jewish to be a suffragist. And that argument also really appealed to a lot of people. So there was a variety of arguments that suffragists made, and I think some of them, many of the most prominent Jewish women suffragists made them all, depending on who they were speaking to. Maud Nathan, who was probably the most prominent American Jewish suffragist, made all those arguments, you know, really just thinking about her audience. When she spoke to Jewish audiences, she used Jewish arguments. When she was speaking to primarily middle-class progressive reformers like herself, she used other kinds of arguments, often about maternalism. She was very involved with the National Consumers League and therefore had many really important, deep, authentic relationships with working class women. And when she spoke to working class women, she talked about how it was not just a question of justice, but expediency. Women who got the vote would have more power and then would list off all the things that were better for working class women in places where women already had the right to vote, which of course, by the end of the suffrage movement was a number of states throughout the country. And so there's a variety of suffrage arguments that could be deployed in different times and spaces. And I don't mean in an instrumental way. I do think that these women genuinely believed in these various arguments, but it was like a toolkit they could reach into and pick out the right tool depending on what they needed to do.
Effective politics and
Yes.
Politicians. Yeah, no, absolutely. You know, one of the conversations that I think has been so constructive about the centennial of the 19th Amendment has been sort of the classism, the racism. We had Professor Rabia Belt talk about the ableism that's baked into the women's suffrage movement, but I haven't heard as much of a conversation about the anti-Semitism that the Jewish women that you profile encountered in the movement. Can you talk a little bit about that, and both on an individual and on a structural level?
Yeah, well, there's two things I'd like to say about that. The first thing is that this is, I think, an issue that is a problem, another problem with American women's history. And of course, I'm speaking to you, Sarah, you've written about Quaker women. You obviously write about religion. Rachel obviously writes about religion. But in many ways, American women's history doesn't do enough about religion. You know, we're also intersectional now, as we should be, don't get me wrong. And we talk about the intersections of race and class and gender and ethnicity and sexuality and all these things, which is good and right and proper. But religion is not always a vector of identity that is included in intersectionality. And so I think what's particularly important in thinking about anti-Semitism in women's movements is a reminder that religion mattered, and it mattered to people then. And even to Jewish women who were not religiously observant for sure, but even that connected to Judaism per se, to religion per se, rather than more of an ethnic or cultural identity, anti-Semitism was still a problem. And so it is worth talking about a little bit. Just another example of how only recently have scholars of suffrage really paid attention to, say, Mormon women or to Catholic women even. So religion is another thing, just as a more general category that has been left out of this conversation in, I think, problematic ways, given how many people that was an important identity category then and now. Anti-Semitism was an issue in the suffrage movement, like racism, like xenophobia. The suffrage movement had many flaws for all the good that it did. And in the earlier years of the suffrage movement, the first generations or so, the first few decades, it wasn't as much of an issue because the American Jewish population was really relatively small before mass migration started in the 1880s. And there were some Jewish women as individuals involved in suffrage, but there wasn't that much of a presence. But the 1890 reunification of the two wings of the suffrage movement, which had split over race, that coincided with the huge growth in the Jewish population in the United States. And at that point, Jewish women, many of whom were coming from Eastern European backgrounds, where if they were not already politically radicalized, at the very least, they were used to a more public role than maybe had been the case for other groups, came to the United States and they got involved in all kinds of isms right away. If they weren't, and some of them came already with these political commitments. And they ran smack into anti-Semitism. One of the classic examples, I guess, I'll say of this is that Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who of course had been a suffrage leader since the beginning, she in 1895 published something called the Woman's Bible. The Woman's Bible, even today, would be tremendously radical. It's a tremendously radical text. It's a takedown of the patriarchy and the misogyny inherent in Western religious traditions, basically, by offering commentary on the Bible. And it's an edited thing, actually. Stanton did not write it by herself, but she had a very strong editorial hand in it. And not all of it is viciously anti-Semitic, but lots of it is viciously anti-Semitic. Now, the mainstream suffrage movement was horrified by the Woman's Bible because it was anti-religious, and they very quickly distanced themselves from Elizabeth Cady Stanton. National and local and state level suffrage societies all over the country were like, no, 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 and they actually denounced it. They would formally write into their minutes, we denounce the Woman's Bible. But they weren't denouncing it because it was anti-Semitic. But for Jewish women, that was a big problem. And the recently founded National Council of Jewish Women, which began in 1893, actually one of its earlier activities was to send a delegation to Stanton to complain. How can you say this? You know, look what you're doing. And Stanton basically blames patriarchy on Judaism. That's an abbreviated way to put it, but it's, I think, a fairly accurate one. And the problem is we have documentation of the National Council of Jewish Women sending out this delegation. But then the story back, we really only have from Stanton. And she basically says she sent them away with a flea in her nerves. But it made Jewish women's organizations extremely wary of formally signing on to the suffrage movement, with the result that an organization like the National Council of Jewish Women, which picked up members by the thousands every year from its founding on, it was crawling with suffragists. The vast majority of National Council of Jewish Women activists or members were suffragists. Local chapters of the National Council had suffrage meetings all the time. They invited nationally known suffragists like Carrie Chapman Catt to come address their triennial convention. So the National Council and the members supported suffrage. And yet they never formally endorsed the 19th Amendment, including as late as 1917. And I think it's because they just couldn't bring themselves to sign on formally to a movement that had been problematic. And it wasn't just Stanton. Another example of anti-Semitism is that in 1915, there were statewide referenda on suffrage in some major northeastern states, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey, and all of them failed. And remember that what the suffrage movement needed was for men to give women the right to vote, because women didn't have the right to vote to give themselves the right to vote, right? This was the conundrum. And after they failed, particularly in New York, many of the suffrage leaders blamed Jews and said, it's these foreigners and especially the Jews, that's why, these are all states that had major immigration, that's why these referenda failed. Now, in fact, that was just categorically and easily provably untrue. The districts that were the most Jewish voted the most heavily, and we're talking 75, 85, sometimes even 90% in favor of suffrage. It was just untrue. But they publicly blamed Jews. And again, that just made organizations like Hadassah by then, or the National Council of Jewish Women, or the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods just really uneasy. And so even though they were full of suffragists, they never formally endorsed the movement. And I'll just quickly say that the other two movements I looked at in my book, Ballots, Babies, and Banners of Peace, Birth Control and Peace, also had problems with anti-Semitism, pretty significant problems. There were, in the case of birth control, it wasn't an actual problem, really. I mean, nowadays there's all this discussion of, Margaret Sanger was a Nazi, which we can't go off on here, but was just untrue. But there was this, people who were anti the birth control movement tried to convince Jews, for instance, that they should not support it because all these people wanted to just stop Jews from having children. We don't have time to go into this here, but that it was a falsehood, and Jewish women knew it. They supported the birth control movement in huge numbers and in all kinds of ways. In the peace movement, anti-Semitism was a very serious problem. In the aftermath of World War I, at international women's conferences, Jews were explicitly blamed for being arms manufacturers and war profiteers. It was something that French and German women could agree on. At the International Women's Suffrage Alliance meeting in 1920, the first held after the war, French and German women, who otherwise were barely speaking to each other, were happy to agree that it was all the Jews' fault. So there was, and that as things took a turn for the worse in the international world during the 1930s, as Hitler was rising to power, Jewish women who had been involved in the peace movement and in the international women's movement for decades were just heartbroken that nobody seemed willing to condemn anti-Semitism. You know, they had all these universalist ideals, and they were really confronted with, well, what do we do now that Jews as Jews are being attacked? And they expected allyship, and they didn't get it. I mean, of course, for some people they did, but overall they did not get it. And so anti-Semitism was a factor in the international women's movement, suffrage, birth control, and peace, and has remained a factor in the international women's movement in some really disturbing ways. That was something, you know, when I was working on the book, I was very distressed by how consistent a feature anti-Semitism has been in many corners of the international women's movement and international feminism since the late 19th century, and really a little bit before that too.
One of the really important things that your book does is is you help us think about Jewish women's activism through 1940, from 1890 to 1940, by looking at the peace movement and the birth control movement alongside the suffrage movement. But so often the story we're used to hearing is about the suffrage movement and really ending the story of first wave feminism in 1920. So what have we been missing by ending that story in 1920?
Yeah, I remember actually as a kid, I think even in elementary school, learning about the 19th Amendment and then saying to a teacher, well, and did they vote? You know, like I wanted to know what happened next. What's next? Of course, the answer is yes, they voted, although another part of the answer is they did not vote as a bloc, and they did not vote as much as you might expect in many ways, and that the voter turnout in the United States in general started on a downward trajectory as soon as women got the right to vote. Okay, that might have been a little too much for fourth grade Melissa Klapper to learn about, but it was, you know, I wanted to know more, and it has been a problem. This is another question of narrative in American women's history. The idea, which I don't know if a lot of Ivy Tower historians necessarily have had, but the public idea that, you know, women got the right to vote and that was it, right? Triumph, victory. But then what, right? What did they do with that vote? And they did lots of different things with that vote, and they certainly didn't all do it together. In the immediate aftermath of the 19th Amendment, male politicians were in fact extremely concerned that women would vote as a bloc, and they rushed to do some things that would, you know, that would benefit women. For instance, passing the Cable Act, which allowed women, American citizen women who married non-citizen men to keep their own citizenship, which had not been the case. Or the Shepherd-Towner Acts, which were basically infant and maternal public health acts. But that wasn't renewed when it came up for renewal in the late 20s, because by then it was already evident that women were not a political bloc and were not going to fix the world just by having the right to vote. And when you look at all the other movements, you know, the birth control and peace movements, for instance, started before women got the right to vote. There were many ways that women were major political actors without having the ballot. And so they started before, they didn't end, they weren't over, right? Was there international peace? No, there was a world war, right? Right? There were wars. I mean, the League of Nations kind of maybe stopped a few conflicts, but was, you know, as we know, not very effective. Birth control was not going away as a need anytime soon. And so on those two movements, at the very least, you know, activism needed to continue. And actually, when it turns out, when you look around, all feminist activism continued. This period after 1920, it used to be called the doldrums, the so-called doldrums, this period between women getting the right to vote, and then somehow Betty Friedan writes The Feminine Mystique in 1963, and boom, there's feminism again. Well, there was plenty of feminism in those intervening years. The National Women's Party tried to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed every year from 1923 on. Something, you know, still a live issue. Industrial feminism in the workplace, you know, as women entered the workforce in greater and greater numbers, was a huge, very important site of feminist activity during these years. There's the anti-nuclear movement, okay? And then eventually the anti-war movement. But even before that, and starting in the 50s, the anti-nuclear movement, which picked up some of the old peaceniks, also, you know, was really a significant movement. There were movements to feed the world during this period that people saw in a feminist way. One of the, Elizabeth Rose, who had been a secretary to Margaret Sanger, kind of after a while that became her cause. She became very involved in ideas about how to effectively bring food and nutrition to everybody in the world, to what we now call the global South in particular. So there was always feminist activism. And in the Jewish case, that activism showed up not just outside the Jewish community, but inside it. One of the first things that many Jewish women did after being enfranchised was to go to their synagogue boards across the United States, across denominations, and say, excuse me, I'm a voting citizen now. I want to be on the board.
Mm-hmm.
And they were, not every synagogue let them in right away, and they weren't always present at the board right away, but within the Jewish community, this model of empowered political leadership, had an impact. And you can see that in lots of different ways. And so, there is no such thing as the doldrums. It just, I think, second wave feminism was so kind of in your face in some ways that it set a model. Like if you're not that kind of activist, if you're not that kind of out there on the street activist like the suffragists had been, like some of the second wave feminists were, then it somehow doesn't count as activism. But several generations of women, Jewish and non-Jewish, were consistently, constantly activist and involved in political and social movements during that period. And I think it's really important. And in the case of American Jewish history, there's kind of this idea that after World War II, that community overall, broad strokes here, but overall became much more conservative as it became lowercase c conservative, but as it became more affluent and more accepted in society, and as anti-Semitism became less acceptable in public expression. But it's really not true. Like even the group of women that get made fun of the most, I think, the Hadassah ladies, right, during that period raised enormous sums and basically built the public health infrastructure of Palestine and then Israel after the state was founded in 1948. They were not just having teas. They were very involved in building this public health and education infrastructure. If you look at what they actually talked about at their meetings, they're not just sitting there wearing circle pins and gloves and sipping tea. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's not the only thing they were doing. The National Council of Jewish Women was heavily, and the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods was heavily involved in all kinds of movements. And so it's just a mistake. And it raises questions about our narrative of American Jewish history, and about American women's history. There's something wrong with it. And I think it is especially significant for American women's history in the sense that if we think of women as being just satisfied, like, oh, we got the right to vote and now we're going home and closing the door and coming out once every 4 years to maybe vote for president, we are doing a tremendous disservice to generation after generation of women who spent a lot of time, energy, and sometimes putting themselves at risk to make the world a better place.
Yeah, I mean, I think the theme of the conference is the unfinished work of suffrage, and we mean that in two ways. One, that these women's political aspirations and the ideals for which they fought were so much broader than just the vote. And then two, if we tell this very narrow story of sort of middle-class, native-born Protestant white women, many of them did stop their activism with the right to vote because that was sort of their very narrow focus. But if we broaden it to include Black women and working women and, female consumers and Jewish women, then the story does go on.
And even some of those, the mainstream women, Carrie Chapman Catt, for instance, became a really significant peace activist. She founded the National Conference on the Cause and Cure of War. I mean, it's, I guess, less surprising that the head of the suffrage movement would continue, her activism, as did Alice Paul, right, the head of the more militant National Women's Party. But they weren't alone, right? The point is that thousands and, hundreds of thousands of women were involved with other things. They just weren't involved. It was less visible because they weren't focused in that way. And it also does a disservice to the earlier history of the suffrage movement, which was really a broader women's movement. It wasn't only about suffrage. There were so many things that women needed to have any chance at any kind of equity in life, in education, in legal status. So what's kind of ironic is that we get this focus. I usually do call in class the fourth grade focus on suffrage. And yet before women got the right to vote, I mean, it's terrible that it took so long, but in fact, women and the men who supported them, who were allies, did achieve a lot before that. Married Women's Property Right Acts, colleges, universities becoming open to women, all kinds of professions opening up to women. None of this is to say that women were equal in that sense, but there was a tremendous amount of progress where women were in 1920 compared to 1848, the year of the Seneca Falls Convention. There's just no comparison. Women's status had improved dramatically. So we do a disservice to both the prehistory of the 19th Amendment and the post-history of the 19th Amendment by being too focused on just suffrage itself, just getting that right to vote.
You know, one question that Rachel came up with, sorry to jump in front of you, but now I'm going to use your question, is could you just talk a little bit about Jewish anti-suffragette activism?
There were, you know, I cannot claim that we never claimed that all, you know, all Jews were suffragists. There were also people who didn't care. I mean, there's always people who just don't care. You know, oh, they have the right to vote, great. And many of them might have used it, but they weren't that involved. But there were Jewish anti-suffragists. It was a pretty small minority, though. If you look at, for instance, the American Jewish periodicals of the day, whether they're in Yiddish or English or Hebrew, actually, there were Zionist American periodicals or German, they're pretty much across the board supportive of suffrage, certainly by the 1890s. They're, you know, they support suffrage. It was a very, and across religious denominations, there was a pamphlet written by an Orthodox rabbi, you know, saying suffrage is great, calling on the same biblical precedents that some of the, you know, other speakers had used. So there was a lot of support, but there were some Jewish anti-suffragists. And my favorite tale of a Jewish anti-suffragist is actually related to a name I already said. I mentioned Maud Nathan. Maud Nathan was, as I said, probably the most prominent American Jewish suffragist. She was well known, she was in New York, she had been involved in the Consumers League, so she was already a political progressive and an activist. Her husband, Frederick, helped found a men's suffrage society in New York, and he was actually in a wheelchair by the time he had to go vote in the 1915 and 1917 referenda in New York. So he was a big supporter. Maud also was very active in the international women's movement. She went to conferences all the time abroad, and where she served as a parliamentarian and translated from English into French and into German. A well-educated woman. Now her sister, Annie Nathan Meyer, had the same family background, same wealthy family background. They were from an old Sephardi family. They were both members of the Daughters of the American Revolution, and proudly so. They grew up in the same synagogue. They grew up with the same parents. Annie Nathan Meyer was instrumental as a founder of Barnard College. So here's someone who believed strongly in women's education. And yet, Annie Nathan Meyer was a staunch anti-suffragist. Okay? You know, she was probably the most prominent Jewish anti-suffragist. And so for a long time, I just couldn't wrap my mind around it. It was very odd. I mean, Annie Nathan Meyer just fit the profile exactly of a suffragist. And in fact, most of the people in charge of the National Association opposed to suffrage sounded exactly like their opponents. Their letterhead looks the same. They use the same language. I mean, you have to actually really read the documents to see who's writing. They sound the same. But Annie Nathan Meyer was a staunch anti-suffragist. For one thing, she really did not like the idea, which she called, quote, spread henism, the idea that the hens would come out and, you know, somehow purify chicken poop. She did not believe in that. She thought women had many flaws and there was no way that women would purify politics. And that, in fact, women might sully themselves by getting involved, which was a very common anti-suffrage argument. And she also, you know, she believed women should have an education, but Annie Nathan Meyer was someone who didn't necessarily think that all men should have the right to vote either. She was a pretty strong elitist and had some qualms about some of the new unwashed immigrants, you know, getting the right to vote. So the two of them, though, also had a deep, abiding personal animosity. And my conclusion, actually, is that the reason that Annie Nathan Meyer said no is because Maud Nathan said yay. They just did not like each other. And Maud Nathan got in there first and said, suffrage. And Annie Nathan Meyer said, well, no, anti-suffrage. And they made a spectacle of themselves. They debated each other in public all the time. They wrote dueling letters to the editor. They, you know, everyone knew about these two sisters. To me, the proof in the pudding that Annie Nathan Meyer was maybe not entirely sincere is that as soon as the 19th Amendment passed, she joined the League of Women Voters. So, now, of course, she always thought that someone like her would be the best kind of women voter if a woman were to vote at all, but it does raise some questions about her sincerity. So there's no organized Jewish anti-suffrage group, but there's also no organized Jewish suffrage group in the United States. Jewish women got involved with other suffrage groups on the local, state, or national level. Only in England. In the UK, there was a Jewish suffrage group. It was the only one in the world. Every place else, Jewish women got involved through other organizations, which meant they were constantly working with lots of different kinds of people. So there's no organized anti-suffragism, but there is some. And I will say in the newspaper coverage, although it is Jewish periodical coverage, although it is very pro, they did, when they were staging symposia, always make sure to include a few anti-suffrage voices. Annie Nathan Meyer was by far the most cogent of those. The others were things like, oh, but we need strong men to protect us, which I honestly just don't think was going to work for most of a Jewish audience. Even people who were ambivalent about suffrage were less likely to buy that argument. But they were represented. So there was some acknowledgement that there was Jewish anti-suffrage sentiment, but it was never from a Jewish place. It was always about gender identity. I never did I see really a Jewish argument against suffrage. I'm sure there were some corners of the more traditionally observant community that might have felt that way, but they didn't, even in their newspapers, they didn't really air that much. So you had the rare individuals, and Maud and Annie Nathan Meyer are just fun to think about.
I love that story of the two sisters. It's so good and captivating and complex. And as a scholar of Jewish memory, my forthcoming book is on Jewish nostalgia, and you're really pushing back against this nostalgic story we might have or might want to have of Jewish suffragists acting as Jews and acting only in one way. And I love that you're complicating that story so deeply. And speaking of books, I wonder if you can tell us about your first book was on Jewish girls coming of age in America, and then your Ballads, Babies, Banners of Peace book is on grown-up Jewish women. Do you see that book as a kind of sequel to your book on Jewish girls?
You know, it's funny. I don't think I ever really thought the word sequel per se. But let me back up a little bit. When I was working on the book on American Jewish girls from about 1860 to 1920, something that was very important to me, and this is kind of a tenet of the history of childhood, right, as another discipline, another kind of subdiscipline, is that you take children where they are, right? You don't spend too much time focusing on who they're going to become later. Oh, this is going to be a famous, this person is going to be a famous scientist later, and that's why I'm looking at their childhood. You try, I mean, it might be why you have documents about their childhood, but you try to keep the focus on them as adolescent girls. That's what I was trying to do. Still, I could not help but notice in the archives when I had information about those girls, and I didn't always know anything about what would happen to them later. Sometimes in the archives, I would just find a random diary from some teenage girl in Chicago, and if I didn't know who she married, she's lost, she gets lost into history in a lot of ways. So I didn't always know what became of them, but I couldn't help but notice that even as teenagers, a very striking number of the diarists and memoirists who I was reading were active in something. They were active in various causes. Sometimes they would start off in debate societies or local literary societies, but many of them had a public life. They had a public life as teenagers, and it made me interested in what was that public life like later. And then, of course, some of those girls were people who became so-called famous women later, and I already knew that they were going to get involved in whatever it was. And so it's a sequel in the sense that I was interested in the way that Jewish girls functioned as kind of agents of acculturation for their families, and what would that mean when they became adults, and what would it mean for how they raised their own daughters? Because in the suffrage movement, for instance, there are multiple mother-daughter pairs, and sometimes grandmother, mother-daughter activists, because it took so long for women to get the right to vote. And so it's a sequel in that sense. And I did definitely go back to the people that I knew, where I knew that there was archival information about their adult lives. In some cases, I very purposefully did not read it when I was working on them as teenagers, but then I did go back to them. And at that point, of course, you start to feel sometimes alarmingly close to some of, my girls, like what happened to them, finding out more. So that I would go back in somebody's diary if I had read it, when they were a teenager, but then I go back and read their diaries from when they're older. It's, fascinating to see if the voice is the same or what the echoes are, how their life experiences change them. So that was something that was very interesting to me. It was a theme that I noticed, and then overwhelmingly, as I did go, and I did try to track down most of the girls from my first book to see if I could find out anything about them in their later lives. And when I could, I would say, maybe at least 90% of the time, and maybe even more, they were involved in something. They were involved in suffrage, they were involved in birth control, they were involved in peace. Some of them really did stay more within the Jewish community or very involved in Zionism. Some of the working class women stayed primarily focused on labor, but it was extremely rare for me to find that one of the girls that I had written about earlier was not active in something later. So I can't, I'm more of a qualitative than a quantitative historian. I'm not going to sit here and say that 100% of all American Jewish women were politically active. I'm not going to say that. But I do think it was a very common, probably more common than not, feature of American Jewish life. Again, something that we just hadn't paid much attention to. And actually, as you could see from my list of books, I kind of go back and forth between writing about American Jewish women and girls and also American childhood from a slightly broader perspective. So my most recent book is a social history of ballet class in America. And I did look for some Jewish content where I could find it, but it's not primarily about Jewish girls and women and Jewish boys, since boys took ballet too. But I did, something else I noticed, and had noticed when working on the Jewish girls book, was that Jewish girls actually went abroad, like a little more than I would have expected. And not just very wealthy Jewish girls, although they were more likely. And then when working on Ballots, Babies, and Banners of Peace, I found that Jewish women went abroad a lot. They went for a variety of reasons, but activism was definitely one of them. Like, more people than you would imagine went to international conferences, international suffrage conferences. There was a World Council of Jewish Women that people went to. There, international birth control conferences, international peace. Many Jewish women got involved with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, where they interacted with women from many other faith backgrounds. Maybe the descendants of some of the Quaker women that Sarah writes about, were involved in this. So that caught my eye, and it was something I've had in the back of my head for a while. So my new project is actually about travel. It's about American Jewish women who traveled abroad between the Civil War and World War II. And again, I am revisiting some of those same people because, again, I might have seen a travel diary in an archive and not really read it when it wasn't as germane to what I was working on, but it is now. And so there'll be lots of people in this new book whom I've not written about before, but there will also be people who, to me, by now are just very familiar characters. And that's to me a real pleasure, to get to go back and really spend time with people in the archives and to get to know their voice and to see how they changed over their own lifetime, and to also look at how an experience of travel has an impact on their lives in all kinds of ways, including activism. And also, I think, a connection to the Jewish community, the international Jewish community. Some of these, for many of these women, whether they were wealthy and went abroad regularly, or middle class and saved up to go abroad once or twice in their lives, or working class women even who were able to take one trip in their lives somewhere, the way that Jewish identity and gender identity affected those trips really had an impact on them afterwards. And there were women who felt a new connection to the Jewish diaspora community in the interwar years, especially as a result of travel, that turns out to be very important as the world is descending into World War II. So it's another fascinating thing to see. And it also allows these women to see what the condition of women's lives are like in other places, not just Jewish lives, but also women's lives. And they sought it out in many cases. They would go looking for, women's groups and women's activism in other places. And many of them went to Europe, and again, a surprising number went to pre-state Israel, to Palestine, but they went other places as well. I recently read a travel journal from somebody who went to India and Cambodia. These are intrepid travelers in the 1910s we're talking about. She had a guide. This woman did have a guide, but he had to literally use a machete to clear out the underbrush so they could even go to Angkor Wat. I mean, now it's a tourist site, but the infrastructure wasn't there in 1912. So it's very interesting to read about that, and this sense of a kind of solidarity that I think we now look at with a very wary eye, because there are so many differences among different kinds of women. And that's an appropriate reaction, but it is also true, and I think it's very true in the first decades of the 20th century, that we don't have to talk about 100% solidarity or sisterhood to note that women did feel a connection to each other as women. And that played an important part of their lives that shouldn't just get overlooked. It mattered to them, so therefore it should matter to us as historians.
I wonder if, for a last question, I suppose this is really for both of you, Melissa and Rachel, and it's just sort of bringing us back to how Rachel framed her last question about nostalgia and memory. And I mean, in some ways, Melissa, you've talked a little bit about this already, how much more complex these women's lives were and how much sort of broader and longer their activism continued. In terms of American women's history, the suffrage centennial, and then also American Jewish history, are there ways that, your work really encourages us to think about this period and these women you know, in that complicates the sort of memory and nostalgia that Rachel is invoking a generation later, right?
Go ahead, Rachel.
I wonder if I can answer Sarah's question and push it further as well. In my work on American Jewish nostalgia, so often the stories that I hear in Jewish public institutions, in museums and other kind of public history sites, are stories of women labor activists at this moment. I'm really looking at the late 20th century and our present moment in the 21st century. And people are eager, I think American Jews are eager to celebrate labor activists in this moment. Those working class women who were fighting for better labor conditions in different ways. And I've heard from these organizations in this moment, I hear less of the stories that you're telling. Maybe somewhat about suffrage, not so much, to be honest. And I really haven't heard public institutions embracing the stories of the birth control movement and of the peace activism movement. And I wonder if you can reflect as well on what is useful, or why might we not be telling, why might those American Jewish institutions not be telling those stories? Why might they not be useful for American Jews?
Well, for peace, there's a pretty clear answer to that, which is that, you know, many, probably the majority of American Jewish women who had been involved in the peace movement had to kind of make an agonizing decision about whether to stick with it or not, as things got worse and worse and worse in Europe. These were savvy women, they were internationalists, they were plugged in, they knew what was happening. And what was happening, as far as they could see, is that Jews were being abandoned by, you know, and most of them left the peace movement. So, for instance, the local chapters of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in the Bronx and in Brooklyn in 1938 and 1939 collapsed because the women, they were almost entirely Jewish, and the Jewish women left because the Women's International League was not acknowledging what they found to be an acceptable way, what was going on. And that was before the war started. Things only got worse from there. And I think that left, and it was also true, actually, I mean, they were focusing on women's activism here, but the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is the Reform Movement's rabbinical association, was also a major peace player in the United States. And there too, you know, people left mostly, you know, they changed their minds. Because of circumstances, not because their convictions about peace had changed, but Hitler was a unique threat, and Nazism needed to be reacted to in a different way. And I think that after the war, after the Holocaust, when it became so clear, you know, what had happened, it was embarrassing to have been associated with the peace movement at all, even though these people left. And these organizations, the CCAR, the Reform Rabbinical Association, the National Council of Jewish Women, and the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods in particular, the three big peace players, all wrote it out of their history. There's a history of the National Council of Jewish Women written in 1945, it doesn't mention peace at all. And there had been a peace committee at the national level since 1908, since before World War I. It just doesn't even mention it. So there was this kind of, we need to silence the fact that we were ever involved with this. And the institutional memory was so overtaken by this new, or we're going to write it out, that in the early 1960s, when the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods was beginning to get involved in anti-nuclear activity, they said, for the first time, we sisterhood members will take up this cause. And it's like, no, it's not the first time, but it was a different generation primarily by then. And some of them, I'm sure, did not know their own history. And I can tell you, especially when the book first came out, I spoke to many National Council of Jewish Women chapters around the country, and none of them had any idea that their organization had been so involved with peace work, not a clue. So there was an intentional writing out, you know, I think it's almost like a manufactured nostalgia in a way, you know, we're going to remember our history the way we want to remember it, and how could we ever have been involved with peace? And that's, you know, it's troubling, but I think it's also understandable, especially in the immediate aftermath of the war. It's maybe, you know, somewhat understandable. There are, you know, to the best of my knowledge, there were also Quakers who had that experience of not knowing how their faith could help them react to something like this. The American Friends Service Committee records from during the war, you know, they were often in place in the 30s, are filled with this kind of, they don't know what to do. They don't know how to react. So I think for peace in particular, that explains it. And I also think, I do not want to go off on this on this road necessarily, but the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 also changed kind of the terms of the debate in many ways. Let's just leave it at that, but that had an impact. For birth control, I think it is very odd. You know, to me, it's a very odd erasure from American Jewish history. I mean, just demographically, it was clear that the American Jewish community very enthusiastically adopted birth control. I mean, it's just, which was not new in the United States. Those trends had already started in Eastern Europe. So it's not new, but it's very clear. Jewish women doctors who could, you know, came into the movement, both, you know, because they wanted to avail themselves of the latest techniques, but also because they often couldn't get jobs. They were discriminated against as doctors, as women and as Jews. And so they went into the birth control movement in large number, and the histories of the birth control movement don't notice that. It's the same thing. It's another one of these erasures. Like, they have their names in the books, but they don't stop to think about, why is it that all these birth control doctors are Jewish women? You know, of course, not 100% of them, but many of them, including several who were involved with the major court cases that eventually removed birth control from the status of obscenity under federal law, for instance. That court case is called Stone versus One Package. Stone, okay, is Hannah Meyer Stone, right, a Jewish woman doctor who was involved in that case. And so it's not clear to me why that has happened, but it was obvious to everybody at the time that social mobility was linked to family size. And not just Jewish communities, but many kinds of people, including many African Americans, you know, wanted control over the size of their families. And this history gets distorted now. This is an ongoing issue. And of course, state policies about eugenics and forced sterilization of women of color. I mean, there's this, you know, horrible, horrendous, terrible racist history, but that's not the same history as birth control clinics, which nobody was ever forced to go into. So women in Harlem, for instance, begged Margaret Sanger to open a birth control clinic there in 1935 that would serve their needs. A Jewish woman doctor was initially in charge of it. When she seemed unable to get along with the African-American nurses and the clients, Sanger removed her and sent in someone else, another Jewish woman. And you can ask questions about why there weren't Black women doctors. I mean, those are legit questions, but there's this interest, I think, more contemporary political interest in recasting the entire birth control movement as racist, eugenicist, and Nazi-ish from its beginnings, which is hugely problematic in terms of historical fact and accuracy. So I think that also has to do with a kind of disassociation. We don't want to have anything to do with this. But it's a shame because it also erases the experience of thousands and thousands and thousands of people and the deep, deep political commitments. This, you know, what better example of the personal is political is there than the birth control movement, right? And that also, you know, it gets associated with the pill, but there was a movement long before there was a pill. So I think, you know, there's like lowercase political interest involved in creating nostalgia and in creating these narratives, both within and outside the Jewish community, that really have had an impact. And one thing I will say is that it's been a little disappointing to me. I think in this centennial year, my book, you know, not because my work is so great, but it is one of the few accounts of Jewish women in these movements. And in this suffrage year, you know, there's been, as there should be, of course, a tremendous amount of attention to African-American women, for instance, in the suffrage movement. And that is extremely important. But some of these other groups, Jewish women, Mormon women, Catholic women, are still not in the big histories that are being released this year. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating because paying attention to race doesn't mean you can't pay attention to other things. And I feel, again, religion just gets knocked out there, and ethnicity kind of gets knocked out in a way that is unfortunate. And in work that is trying to be anti-nostalgic, but yet ends up replicating some of those same omissions, I think it's disturbing. It's something that I've been observing all year.
Well, and so intersectional too. I mean, to talk about Catholics and Jews at the turn of the 20th century is to also talk about the creation of whiteness and, you know, and race and ethnicity and xenophobia and all of these things, right? So.
And also to look at the different intersections at the time. I mean, there were Jewish women who were very uncomfortable with the racism of the suffrage movement and said so, and there were also Jewish women who had nothing to say about it. You know, they just, and partially because Jews' identity as white was still kind of tenuous. And so this was another opportunity to demonstrate whiteness. You know, I don't think that the majority of Jewish women in the suffrage movement consciously thought about it that way, even in the South, but that's an element too. And nostalgia shouldn't write that out either. Nor should it write out the Jewish women who were very upset about this and protested about racism and protested anti-Semitism. But some of those women still continued to work. I mean, they were working within the framework they had. So the National Women's Party is a good example of this. Alice Paul was well known by her friends and colleagues to be sort of genteelly anti-Semitic. She was not a vicious or theological anti-Semite. She helped Jews, it should be said, in the 30s when she was living in Geneva during the disarmament conferences. She signed affidavits to help some Jewish families. She was not personally anti-Semitic, but she still had this kind of elitist, Jews aren't quite thing. And everybody around her knew it, including the Jewish women who worked with her in the 60s when they were doing oral histories, always said to the interviewer, well, do you know about Alice Paul and Jews? I mean, one after another say that in their oral histories. And yet they worked with her anyway because they believed in the Equal Rights Amendment, and the National Women's Party was the way to go for that. And so they, you know, held their nose and were willing to work with her. And it is the case that some of Alice Paul's best lieutenants were Jewish women, particularly a woman named Anita Politzer from Charleston. So, you know, people's lives are messy, and nostalgia covers over the messiness, or it only has the picturesque messiness, you know, all the kind of family messiness. And I think that, you know, it does a great disservice to the people who were active in these movements, or even who chose not to be active in these movements or to oppose them, to pretend that everything was peaches and cream all the time, when these, you know, just like our time is extremely complicated and messy, so it was then too. But what they kept their eye on, the suffragists, was we want the right to vote. And to me, I hope it's not only nostalgia, you know, or appreciation for them to say that the best thing we can do to honor the legacy of all these people, whoever they were in the suffrage movement, is to vote.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. That is such an important, good, true note to end on, and just so crucial. So thank you to both of you for joining us in our conversation today about suffrage, the centennial, the 19th Amendment. I think these two books would be wonderful to read as a pair, to think about Jewish women's contributions to the suffrage movement, and then also how we remember them. So thanks again to both of you. We really appreciate your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.